Do you already know who you could be? Not in a vague someday sense, in the specific, uncomfortable sense. The version of you that makes the decisions you keep deferring, that does the work you keep almost starting, that lives in a way you'd actually respect. You know that person. You've known them for years. And the fact that you're still watching videos like this one means the distance between who you are and who that person is hasn't closed. Here's what nobody has the courage to say out loud. The problem isn't motivation. It isn't clarity. It isn't discipline or timing or waiting for the right circumstances to align. The problem is that you've been trying to build the wrong floor. Abraham Maslow spent decades doing something no psychologist before him had thought to do seriously. He studied not the sick, not the broken, not the average, but the people who had genuinely become who they were capable of being. And what he found wasn't what anyone expected. These people weren't the most talented. They weren't the most driven. They weren't the ones who had pushed hardest through pain and resistance. They were the ones who had been ruthlessly honest about where they actually were, and who had built from there, in the right order. That last part is the one that costs people years, because the version of you that you carry around in your head, the one who is confident, purposeful, fully alive, can't be willed into existence from wherever you're standing right now. It has to be built, and it has to be built on a specific foundation, in a specific sequence that most people either skip entirely or never examine at all. This is not a video about inspiration. I am not here to remind you of your potential or tell you to believe in yourself. I am here to show you the architecture, the actual psychological structure that separates the people who become who they wanted to be from the people who spend their lives feeling like they're almost there. By the end of this, you will know exactly where in that structure your scaffolding is missing, and you will know what to build next. There is a particular kind of suffering that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't feel like failure. It feels like effort. Constant, sincere, exhausting effort that somehow never compounds into the person you're trying to become. You read the books. You set the goals. You have the conversations with yourself at 2 in the morning about finally getting serious. And then, 6 months later, you're having the same conversation again. Most people diagnose this as a motivation problem, or a discipline problem, or a focus problem. They look for better systems, better habits, better accountability structures. What they almost never do is ask the question that actually matters. Am I trying to build on a floor that hasn't been laid yet? This is what Maslow understood that almost everyone else missed. In Motivation and Personality, Maslow described the human needs not as a list, but as a hierarchy, a structure of prepotency, where each level must be sufficiently met before the next one can fully emerge. This wasn't a metaphor. It was an observation about how the human organism actually allocates its resources. When a lower need goes chronically unmet, the psyche doesn't simply note the deficiency and move on. It consciously or unconsciously redirects every available resource: attention, energy, cognitive capacity, emotional bandwidth, toward resolving that deficit. The higher needs don't disappear. They get pushed underground, where they press for expression in distorted ways. What this means in practice is brutal in its simplicity. You cannot self-actualize your way out of unmet safety. You cannot build genuine confidence on a foundation of unresolved belonging. You cannot pursue your highest potential while your nervous system is quietly managing a threat it has never named. Here is the first thing worth doing with this. Not someday, but today, after this video ends. Sit down with a piece of paper and ask yourself, honestly, which level you are actually operating from right now. Not which level you aspire to. Not which level you think you should be at, given your age or your circumstances. Which level your behavior, your rumination, your emotional reactions, and your default decisions reveal that you are actually living from. The answer is almost always 1 or 2 levels lower than people expect. The reason this diagnostic matters so much is that the wrong intervention at the wrong level doesn't just fail, it actively drains you. A person operating from unmet safety needs who throws themselves into purpose-driven work isn't building towards self-actualization. They're using higher-level activity to avoid confronting what's actually wrong. It feels like progress. It produces the aesthetics of growth, the productivity, the content, the forward motion, without the substance. Maslow was blunt about this pattern. He wrote that a person who is dominated by an unmet need sees the entire world through that need's lens. The hungry man thinks that if he could only have food, he'd want nothing else. The unsafe person genuinely believes that if they could only achieve enough, they'd finally feel secure. The person starved for belonging convinces themselves that success will bring connection. None of these are true. Gratifying a higher need does not reach back down and fill the gap in the lower one. So before anything else, before the goal setting, before the habit building, before the identity work, you need to know where the scaffolding is actually missing, because the rest of this video is a map, and maps are only useful when you know where you're starting from. In the next part, we go to the level most ambitious people refuse to examine, because it feels too elementary for someone who wants more. It isn't. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. There is a specific kind of person who finds the idea of safety needs almost insulting. They are driven, self-aware, intellectually serious. They have read enough psychology to know that Maslow's hierarchy exists, and they have quietly decided that the bottom levels don't apply to them, that safety and stability are concerns for other people with more obvious problems, not for someone who is already reaching for something higher. This is one of the most expensive assumptions a person can make. Maslow was precise about what safety actually means at the psychological level. It isn't just physical security, a roof, food, the absence of immediate danger. It is the felt sense that the world is predictable enough to be navigated, that the ground beneath you is stable enough to build on. It includes financial stability, yes, but also psychological stability. A baseline sense that you are not perpetually one mistake away from collapse, that your identity is not so fragile that ordinary criticism constitutes a threat, that you are not secretly running from something that has never been named. What makes this insidious is that chronic psychological insecurity doesn't look like fear. In ambitious people, it looks like overachievement. It looks like relentless productivity that somehow never produces peace. It looks like an inability to tolerate stillness, because stillness is when the unnamed thing gets loud. It looks like the persistent sense that whatever you've accomplished isn't quite enough, not because you have high standards, but because you're using achievement to manage a threat rather than to express a self. Watch for this specific pattern in your own behavior. When you achieve something you genuinely wanted, how long does the satisfaction last before the anxiety returns? If the answer is hours or days, or if the satisfaction never fully arrives at all, if there is always a faster pivot to the next goal before you've absorbed the last one, that is not ambition. That is a safety need wearing ambition's clothing. Maslow observed that a person dominated by unmet safety needs will organize their entire cognitive and emotional life around threat reduction. They become, in his words, safety-seeking mechanisms, not bad people, not weak people, but people whose nervous system has commandeered all available resources for a single purpose. In this state, what looks like strategic thinking is often threat scanning. What looks like planning is often the construction of elaborate protections against every possible thing that could go wrong. The practical move here is not to solve this overnight. It is to name it. To sit with the honest question, what would I have to stop doing if I no longer needed to prove I was safe? What decisions am I making from fear of losing something rather than desire to build something? Those two categories of decision, fear-driven and growth-driven, feel almost identical from the inside. The difference is in what they produce over time. Fear-driven decisions create the appearance of progress, while quietly reinforcing the belief that you are not yet secure enough to stop running. Building genuine safety is not glamorous work. It means addressing the actual sources of instability in your life rather than papering over them with activity. It means, sometimes, slowing down before you can accelerate. It means tolerating the discomfort of honesty about what is actually unresolved. But here is what Maslow also found, and this matters. People who do address this layer don't just feel calmer. They become cognitively sharper. Their perception of reality becomes more accurate, less distorted by threat. Their decisions get cleaner. The energy that was quietly being consumed by threat management becomes available for something else entirely. That something else is what the next part is about. Because once the foundation is real, the next layer reveals a need that is just as fundamental and just as easy for serious people to misread as weakness. There is a story that capable, self-directed people tell themselves about belonging and esteem. The story goes like this: needing other people's approval is a weakness. Caring what others think is a trap. The truly strong person builds from within, independent of external validation, answerable only to their own standard. It is a compelling story. It is also, in Maslow's framework, a partial truth weaponized into a lie. The distinction Maslow drew was not between needing people and not needing people. It was between deficiency-driven need and healthy, integrated relatedness. The person who has genuinely met their belonging and esteem needs doesn't become independent of others. They become free within their relationships. The person who hasn't met those needs, and who then constructs an ideology of self-sufficiency around that unmet hunger, hasn't transcended the need. They've buried it. And buried needs don't dissolve. They shape behavior from below, invisibly, with far more force than acknowledged ones. Maslow was direct about the consequences of thwarted belonging. He wrote that love and affection needs, when chronically unmet, become the most commonly found core in cases of maladjustment. Not a contributing factor, the core. The person who has never experienced genuine belonging, not performed togetherness, not transactional connection, but the felt sense of being known and accepted, carries that deficit into every room they enter. It colors their ambition, their creativity, their relationship to their own work. It makes self-expression feel dangerous, because expression requires visibility, and visibility without safety is exposure. Notice this in yourself. Is there work you are not putting into the world because some part of you is not yet sure you have the right to take up space? Is there a version of your life you are not fully inhabiting because you have not yet resolved, at the level of felt experience rather than intellectual conviction, that you belong in it? These are not rhetorical questions. They have specific, observable answers in specific, observable behaviors. The project you keep refining past the point of readiness, the relationship you keep at arm's length, the room you enter already half apologizing for your presence. The esteem layer adds another dimension that Maslow treated with unusual precision. He distinguished between two kinds of esteem: esteem based on genuine competence and achievement, and esteem based on the opinions and approval of others. The second kind, he argued, is inherently unstable. Because it has no foundation in reality, it must be constantly renegotiated. The person who builds their self-regard on external validation is not building self-esteem. They are building a performance that requires an audience. And a performance that requires an audience is not a self. It is a position that must be defended. The move toward genuine esteem is not a move away from others. It is a move toward honesty about what you have actually earned versus what you are claiming. It means being willing to do the work that produces real competence in private before the audience arrives. It means tolerating the period of genuine obscurity that precedes genuine authority. Most people short-circuit this process by seeking the markers of esteem, the recognition, the status, the external confirmation, before the internal foundation is real. The result is a self-image that is always one bad day away from collapse. In Motivation and Personality, Maslow wrote that the most stable self-esteem is built not on fame or adulation, but on deserved respect. Respect that is earned through actual capacity, actual contribution, actual presence in the world. The word deserved is doing significant work there. It implies that you know, privately, before anyone tells you, that what you have made is real. That private knowing, that internal authority, is what makes the transition to the next level possible. Because what Maslow found in the people who had genuinely arrived there was not what most people imagine. It was not certainty. It was not the absence of doubt. It was something quieter and considerably more demanding. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. The popular image of the self-actualized person is essentially a fantasy of arrival, someone serene and certain, operating from a place of permanent clarity, no longer troubled by the ordinary frictions of human existence, someone who has, finally, figured it out. Maslow spent years studying people who fit his criteria for self-actualization, and what he found was almost the opposite of this image. It was close enough to ordinary human life to be disorienting, and demanding enough to make most people quietly relieved they hadn't looked too carefully. The first and most consistent characteristic he documented was not confidence or charisma or visionary thinking. It was perceptual accuracy. Self-actualizing people, Maslow observed, saw reality more clearly than others, not because they were smarter, but because they were less afraid. They were not constantly filtering their perception through the lens of threat or wish or the need to be confirmed. They could look at a situation, at a person, at themselves, and see what was actually there rather than what their anxiety or their ego required it to be. This sounds simple. It is extraordinarily rare. The practical consequence of this is significant, and it applies directly to where you are right now. Distorted perception is not a character flaw. It is a symptom of unmet needs operating below the level of conscious awareness. When safety is unresolved, you perceive threats that aren't there. When belonging is unresolved, you read neutrality as rejection. When esteem is unresolved, you interpret honest feedback as an attack. The work of moving toward clearer perception begins not with trying to see more accurately, but with addressing the needs that are currently distorting your view. Begin practicing this now. When you have a strong emotional reaction to something, a conversation, a piece of feedback, a person's silence, pause before you act on the interpretation your mind offers first. Ask which need that reaction is protecting. You will find, with enough honest attention, that most of your strongest reactions are not responses to what actually happened. They are responses to what a frightened, or lonely, or unacknowledged part of you heard instead. The second characteristic Maslow documented was what he called acceptance, of self, of others, of reality as it presents itself. This was not passivity or resignation. It was the absence of the exhausting, continuous project of arguing with what is. Self-actualizing people, he wrote, could take their own frailties and shortcomings in the same unquestioning spirit with which one accepts the characteristics of nature. They did not need themselves to be other than they were in order to function. This freed an enormous amount of energy that most people spend in the continuous, largely unconscious project of managing the gap between who they are and who they think they should be. What is worth extracting from this is not an instruction to stop trying to grow. It is a distinction between growth that comes from genuine desire and growth that comes from self-rejection. The first expands you. The second exhausts you without moving you forward, because you are simultaneously trying to become more and treating your current self as the enemy. Maslow was clear. The self-actualizing person does not grow by escaping who they are. They grow by becoming more fully what they already are. The third characteristic, and perhaps the most operationally useful, was what Maslow called problem centering. Self-actualizing people were, almost without exception, oriented towards something outside themselves. A task, a mission, a problem that enlisted their capacities and demanded their best attention. They were not, in the ordinary sense, working on themselves. They were working on something that mattered, and self-development was a byproduct. This is a reversal of the approach most people take, which is to work on themselves in preparation for eventually doing something that matters. That preparation, without a real problem to organize around, tends to be infinite. The question worth sitting with here is not, what do I want to become? It is, what problem am I actually willing to give my life to? The answer to that question, when it is honest, tells you more about where you are in the hierarchy than any amount of self-reflection. Because the capacity to orient towards something genuinely beyond yourself, not as performance, not as identity construction, but as real commitment, is itself evidence that the lower needs have been sufficiently met. Which brings us to the part most people are waiting for, and the part Maslow himself was most careful about: how you actually build this, deliberately, from wherever you are standing right now. The most dangerous idea in the self-development space is that transformation happens in a single moment of clarity, a decision, an insight, a conversion experience that permanently reorganizes who you are. What Maslow observed instead was quieter and considerably more demanding. Growth as a continuous process of small decisions that either expand or contract the self, made daily, mostly invisibly, in the specific situations where it is easier to retreat than to advance. He was also careful about something most people in this space refuse to say directly. Meeting your basic needs does not automatically produce growth. It produces the conditions for growth. The person who finally achieves financial stability, or finds genuine belonging, or earns real self-respect does not automatically become self-actualizing. They simply remove the obstacle that was preventing it. What happens next depends entirely on what they choose to do with the space that opens up. The first concrete practice is the honest inventory, not a journal entry about who you want to be, a clear-eyed accounting of which needs are actually met and which are not. Look at your safety reality. Is your financial situation stable enough that you are not quietly managing low-grade financial terror? Is your daily structure genuinely solid, or are you performing stability while managing instability underneath? Look at your belonging reality. Do you have relationships in which you are actually known, not just liked? Look at your esteem reality. Is your self-regard based on something real and tested, or is it contingent on external confirmation that must be constantly renewed? Most people will find at least one level where the honest answer is significantly worse than the comfortable answer. That gap is precisely where the work begins. Once you identify the layer where the scaffolding is missing, resist every impulse to skip it. This is harder than it sounds, because skipping usually feels like ambition. What it actually is, in most cases, is avoidance. Because genuinely addressing an unmet need requires a kind of vulnerability that is far more uncomfortable than working harder at the level above it. Addressing unmet safety means making actual changes to reduce real instability, not managing the anxiety that instability produces. Addressing unmet belonging means entering real relationships with real exposure. Addressing unmet esteem means doing the work that builds genuine competence before the external confirmation arrives. In Motivation and Personality, Maslow observed that it is precisely those individuals in whom a need has always been satisfied who are best equipped to tolerate deprivation of that need in the future. This resilience cannot be faked or reasoned into existence. It has to be built through actual experience of having the need genuinely met. Every day presents a version of the same choice. The decision that slightly expands who you are, or the one that slightly contracts it. What you're building, layer by layer, is not a better version of yourself. It is the actual version, the one that was always structurally possible, and that becomes real only through the accumulation of these small, mostly private, mostly unglamorous choices. There is one final thing Maslow said about this process. It is the most uncomfortable thing in everything he wrote. There is a word that appears in Maslow's writing that most people skip over because it lands too hard. The word is accidie, borrowed from medieval theology, used to describe the sin of failing to do with your life all that you know you could do. Not failure through ignorance, not failure through circumstance, failure through the quiet daily choice to remain smaller than you are capable of being. Every departure from your own potential, Maslow wrote, registers in the unconscious. Every time you choose the safer version of a decision, the smaller expression of an idea, the retreat from something you were capable of, it records itself, not loudly, but it accumulates. And the accumulation produces something that is not quite depression and not quite dissatisfaction and not quite self-contempt, but contains elements of all three. What makes this different from ordinary guilt is the direction it points. The person you could become is not a fantasy. It is a real psychological structure, a set of capacities pressing for expression from inside you right now, blocked not by fate or circumstance, but by the specific unmet needs and avoidance decisions that have accumulated across years of choosing the retreat. The distance between who you are and who you could be is not a measure of your failure. It is a map of your remaining work. Here is the only action that matters after this video ends. Go back to the inventory, the honest one, and identify the single layer where the gap between your real situation and your stated situation is largest. The layer where you have been telling yourself a story that does not match the evidence. That layer is where your next year lives, not in the goals above it, in the specific, unglamorous, necessary work of addressing what is unresolved there. Maslow found, after years of study, not a type of person that is rare or constitutionally different from everyone else. He found people who had been honest about where they were, about what they needed, about what they were avoiding, and who had built from there, one layer at a time, without skipping the parts that were inconvenient. That is available to you, not as inspiration, as architecture. If what you watched today opened something that isn't finished yet, the video on your screen right now will take it further. Click and keep building.